Welcome to another session from the Debate Central, Odisha Podium, Debating WhatsApp, and Global Speech and Debate Council. Pinelle is one of the most experienced debaters from Africa who we have to learn a lot from, and I'm pretty sure they'll give us a lot of information about judging in general and also talk about different aspects of fundamentals of judging as well as how judging affects different strategies and what strategies to employ when doing this activity. We're very happy to have Pinelle on board for having this session with us today, and I'm pretty sure it will be something that people who are tuning in live today as well as who are going to watch this on YouTube will get a lot of information from. Thank you, Pinel. I'm handing over to you whenever you're ready.
All right, cool. Thank you so much for having me for the session. It's really, really cool to be able to, help out with these workshops. I am pretty passionate about judging, so I am just going to uh give you the basic tips because I think that sometimes when people are judging, we kind of forget the basics that the manual is telling us to follow, that we're trained to follow. So this is kind of just like a refresher session and just I'll try to give a few tips on how to reinforce those basics and just make it easier to judge. This is the judging basic session. I think a few things that we're just going to go through is a reminder on what the ordinary or average intelligent voter is, some tips on argument assessment, case evaluation and weighing, how to how to be a good panelist and how to be a good chair has to do mainly with how to be useful during panel discussions. So there's going to be a few tips for that. Then some tips on how to deliver oral adjudication and tips on note taking. So let's get into it. Just a reminder, not all the content is on the slides, so bear with me in terms of that. There's just going to be a point where you see further discussions, and then that's just going to be me, like, just like speaking for the rest, and just giving you the tips instead of you seeing it on the slides. But let's get into it. So, the average intelligent voter, in debating is, yeah, that weird identity that you have to adopt when you are a judge. And I guess some of the, like, I don't know if I can call it discourse, but some of the discussions around the average intelligent voter is that it's quite unrealistic and it's kind of weird to expect someone who has an identity to just be as stripped away of that identity as possible. This is mainly because they think that the average person in real life isn't someone that doesn't come from anywhere or isn't someone that doesn't have some sort of specialized knowledge. However, this is I still think that it's quite important to remember to be an average intelligent voter because um, that practically informs how the space works. Because debating at the end of the day is, I guess, the art of persuasion. It's how well you're able to convince anyone and anything, right? On anything that is possible. So if you as a judge are going to practically uphold the sanctity of that, you need to be the average intelligent voter. So to the greatest extent, you do need to adopt that. And what is that personality or what is that? So like the average intelligent voter, according to the manual, is someone who would like regularly read major newspapers or major or like follow major news outlets, but you don't memorize the specific content of it. So you don't know the exact number of people that were like shot in a mass shooting or something, but you do understand the place and the time in which a mass shooting might have taken out. You don't necessarily know the specific figures that are being given to you when there's like an economic commentary on how, I don't know, like the state of South Africa is doing, but you kind of have that grasp or you kind of have that understanding that, okay, of what the figures could mean when you are engaging with those news outlets or when you are engaging with general news. That's important because any global citizen, I guess, like any global citizen, anyone around the world who has access to knowledge, who has access to I don't know, society, who is intelligent, has a working and functioning brain and the capacity to express themselves and so on and so forth, would know these little bit of things because it because that specific knowledge that, or that specific information that is coming from those major newspapers affects so many other things. So that's one thing that you would need to do if you are the average intelligent voter. It continues. You have like a good deal of broad knowledge, but you don't have deep knowledge. So you know a lot of little things. Well, you know a lot of things, but you don't know it to a huge extent. You're not necessarily Sheldon, who like knows everything about like physics or something, but you could perhaps have a basic knowledge on like Newton's law or whatever. You are capable of understanding complex concepts, facts, or arguments. You don't necessarily come from a particular place, and thus you don't have specialist knowledge about that place. But that doesn't mean that you like just that does not mean that you don't know basic knowledge about that place. So let's say I'm Congolese, right? In as I am judging, I'm not going to be judging the debate as a Congolese person who only knows the world through the lens of what is happening in the DRC. However, I will still be able to understand arguments that are related to the DRC in its context, whether that's really basic knowledge, whether that's an argument about the processes happening in the DRC. I'm not going to fault any of the speakers if they get the processes wrong. Well, if they get it wrong, yes, because that's a fallacy and you can't credit fallacies. But if it's not necessarily specific, or if there's certain parts that they're missing about whatever democratic process or economic process or whatever could be happening, I'm not going to fault that because that isn't something that I should be knowing in my capacity as the average intelligent voter. Um, you're not someone who understands like specialized language or technical terms that could only be learned if you are in that specific university class or a part of that specific career field, right? So you would know like the more you debate, you would be familiar with certain terms, like maybe you would understand certain political terms, certain terms that are applied to the world of finance, and so on and so forth. But those are the as technical as it can get. It cannot necessarily be more technical than that. Something that you could only find if you read like a journal article on the workings of like ChatGPT in the financial sector, or like a medical journal specifying how many deaths are happening due to HIV or something. It can't necessarily, you really need to leave all that technical jargon behind you. And no debater can expect you to also adopt that technical jargon. You don't have preformed views on the motion or on the topic of the motion. So if it's a motion about feminism and you're a huge feminist, I'm sorry, you just can't have that preformed view because that would affect the way in which you allow yourself to be convinced. More on your ability to be convinced. You're not convinced by how sophisticated something sounds. You're not convinced by deception. You're not convinced by logical fallacies, meaning that you have the capacity to evaluate truth and logic, right? And you have the like capacity and the leeway as a judge to go ahead and evaluate truth and logic. Debaters can't just come up to you and say whatever. This isn't them trying to con you into a romantic relationship and you just let them because you think they're cute. This, you really need to do that evaluation of asking yourself, would anyone else around the world genuinely buy into this? Would anyone around the world believe this to be true? And then lastly, you are open-minded. And because you are concerned on the decision about the debate, at the end of the debate, you are willing to be convinced by all the debaters in the room. You don't have beef with anyone that suddenly blocks your ears from their arguments and you suddenly cannot hear what they are saying. You take into consideration every single bit of that information and you weigh it up and you evaluate it in order to determine the call at the end of the day, right? So, like, that is the persona of the average intelligent voter. It isn't something that is hard to adopt. Um, I think that another thing that I would like to hammer on the average intelligent voter is this idea of intelligence, right? Because I think that at least when I've been judging with people, especially when they are newer to judging or newer to debating in general, like there is this thing that just stops you from genuinely calling out speakers when they are lying or calling out speakers when there is like a logical fallacy within the case. Because you are intelligent, as I said before, you have the capacity to call it out and to discredit the argument at that extent. So always ensure that you do know the ordinary knowledge that anyone around the world would know and should know if they want to survive in this world, so that you also have the capacity to call them out. Another way that, like you could be doing this by just keeping up with news daily, or you could just go ahead and like quickly search before you have to go into the room what the motion is about, what the things in the motion are going to be talking about. Because unlike speakers who, they can't have access to technology to go ahead and like Google, you as the judge kind of do. It's not something that's prohibited. So you can quickly give a search about, I don't know, if the motion is about ChatGPT, you can, or like about, not ChatGPT, it's okay, like deepfake technology and sex technology, and you don't know anything about that, you can quickly give a search. You can quickly ask around. You can quickly educate yourself before the motion starts. I mean, before you call the debate to start, just so that you have an idea of what is supposed to be spoken about, what the debaters are likely to speak about, and then, you're kept up and you know what's going to happen. Well, not know what's going to happen, but you kind of more or less know what is to happen. So, yeah, that's the average intelligent voter, the persona you're supposed to adopt. Now, the next thing is practically how to track an argument when they are presenting an argument. Because, yeah, the manual speaks a lot about the types of arguments that you could go ahead and have. So there's the presentation of empirical evidence. There's the presentation of, like moral intuitions that we just buy into naturally. There's so many things that can be like spoken of as an argument, but in order to really evaluate an argument, you need to really ask yourself the following. The first thing you need to ask yourself is this true? Right? This goes back to the evaluating fallacies or evaluating deceptions, right? Because if something isn't true, if it's not true in its premise, if it's not true, if the premise does not necessarily link to the rest of the explanation that is being presented, if the explanation that is being presented is not true in relation to the motion, then you cannot necessarily credit that argument highly in the debate, right? So you need to ask yourself, is this true? Is this something that the average intelligent voter would buy into? Is this something that actually exists in status quo? The next question is this important, right? What does it actually do for the debate and mean in relation to the motion, right? Does it mean that we are like accruing a really huge impact? Is it important because there's a level of urgency? Is it important because it's like a perpetuating problem that has been leading to the death of millions and millions of people? Is the response that is given to an argument that important because it takes down an argument or mitigate it a bit? Or is it not important because it actually doesn't shift the debate or shift that opponent's case to a different level, or does like it just doesn't do anything for it? So when asking yourself, is it important? Ask yourself, what is it actually doing in the grander scheme of the debate? And then lastly, and I think this is a really, really important question to ask because sometimes we miss this as judges if things are intuitive. But you need to ask yourself if this is actually proven, right? So did teams actually do the work to prove that the argument is true, that the argument is important, and that the argument should stand in the debate? What is the layers of argumentation that has actually been presented in order to back up the argument, right? are there actually layers of argumentation that are presented to back up the argument? Were layers of argumentation needed to back up the argument in the first place? Or is it a genuine moral intuition that we can just opt into? Those are the type of questions that you need to ask yourself when evaluating if an argument has genuinely been proven. Because if you don't, then you run the risk of letting teams then just make assumptions and get away with those assumptions, right? You need to ensure that this also goes back to why you like need to adopt the personality of the average intelligent voter. Because if you have so like if you don't, you run the risk of letting intuitions that are innate to you, that are personal to you, your own personal convictions and so on and so forth, be the metric to which you deem something as generally intuitive or not. So just be very careful with when you ask yourself if something is really proven and just, yeah, ask yourself that question. Now, remember, because these don't exist on a binary, these questions aren't a straight yes or a straight no, because in debating, there's nuance. In debating, things lie on a spectrum, things have differing layers of logic behind them. So after asking yourself, is this X? Ask yourself, how how true is it? Or how important is it? Or how proven is it? In order to practically understand where it's standing within the debate in relation to truth, in relation to importance, in relation to logic, in relation to proof. So you ask yourself, is this? And then to what extent, in order to really evaluate the argument fairly. Those are the only three questions you really do need to ask yourself. And when you start asking yourself these questions, you're going to start seeing that it becomes easier to credit arguments, and you're going to be, yeah, to credit arguments in and of themselves, and then easier to just credit arguments in relation to other arguments. And it also just makes prioritization easier at the end of the day. If I am going too slow, I mean too fast as well, just tell me so that I can slow down. But I hope like we're on track and everyone's fine thus far. A tip to just help with argument assessment as well is the clean analysis. So now I know like speakers use clean analysis mainly in order to really layer their argumentation, right? So they give you the consequences, they tell you why the consequences is legitimate or why their point is legitimate. They tell you it's effective. They tell you that this is going to be something that's going to change the lives of so many people and that this is something that's really, really important. Because this is how a lot of speeches are layered, especially like with more experienced debaters, it's important to also just like listen out for these things when you are judging, right? So when we're talking about consequences, we are looking at the impact of something. The consequences don't necessarily have to be bad in and of themselves. They could just be good, but like, what are the impacts that are going to accrue from whatever the team is trying to run or whatever the speaker is trying to run? Then you ask yourself, is that legitimate, right? So is that consequence something that is justified in attaining? Is the way in which they are proposing we attain this consequence something that is justified? Is it like principally sound? Does it does it make sense to go ahead and look for this specific consequence in the specific manner that the team is asking us to, like seek for it with the specific mechanism that they are proposing. Then, to further evaluate the strength of that mechanism that is being proposed, you ask yourself the two E's. You ask yourself, what is the efficacy behind the mechanism that is being proposed or the mechanism that is being rebutted? Like, what is this something that can be done effectively and can actually produce the desired results or the desired consequences that are being presented to the House? But then secondly, in terms of efficiency, Is this a plausible way of achieving that consequence, that impact? Does it waste any of our resources, whether it be time, whether it be money, whether it be like human capital? Does it waste any of the resources? Like, is this the most cost-effective mechanism that we could adopt, given the limited resources that we do have and the limited capacity that we as actors in the debate might have, right? Um, and the last question in terms of the like E and the evaluation of mechanisms is asking yourself, is the process comparable to the consequences that are being presented or that are being fought for by that team? Because if you're going to like do something that is really, really crazy and takes up so many resources for a very minimal impact, then it's not comparable. It is not worth it at the end of the day. So those are a few questions that you can ask yourself for the evaluation of the mechanisms. Then in terms of accessibility, in terms of scope and magnitude, you're pretty much asking yourself, okay, with what the team or with what the speaker or what the case is trying to present to us today, like, is that consequence something that it can be felt by a large number of people? Like, to what extent can we feel this? How many people can experience this consequence? How accessible or how easy or in what capacity are we able to genuinely like adopt the process or ensure that this consequence continues and so on and so forth? Like, how easy it is it to actually attain or reach? And then necessity is like a pretty simple one to look for. You're asking yourself, is this important? Is this the priority in the debate, right? Should we be valuing X over Y or Y over X, right? Asking yourself these questions, sorry about that. Asking yourself these questions just also help in answering the extent to which the first three questions apply. So the questions about truth, the question about importance, and the question about how proven is it. It just helps you really, really like see where this argument is going and whether that argument is fulfilled in the first place. Now, moving on. All the teams in the debate have like given their arguments, right? Now you have these four cases that have been that you have. Like you have four cases that you need to go ahead and weigh up against each other. All of them are strong because, well, not all of them, not all the time are they strong, but a lot of the times, cases in their own right will be strong. Cases in their own right are just absolutely strong. Now, the trick with judging is trying to evaluate the comparative strength of each case in relation to the other cases, right? And it's kind of tricky. How do you do this? Especially considering the fact that as a judge, you're supposed to be evaluating the debate on clashes, and the clashes might not necessarily be clear. You first of all need to remember that you aren't the one that decides the metrics and the clashes to which the debate is going to be won by. Those need to be determined by the teams. And practically, when weighing a debate, you need to practically follow this algorithm for weighing. So the first one is asking yourself, is there one thing all teams explicitly agree is true and important, right? Um, because that becomes the debate. That's probably what the debate was about. That is probably what the biggest clash in the debate was about. So an example for this is if all four teams in the debate were saying that the most important thing in this debate is to go ahead and save the most amount of lives. And the debate practically boils down to how we ensure that the most amount of lives are saved. that becomes the thing that you evaluate the debate on. There could be other clashes, so maybe the other thing that they all explicitly are saying is true and important is that we need to not just save the most amount of lives, but we also need to ensure that those lives, like people are able to actualize after this event. They're able to have regular lives, lives with dignity, and so on and so forth. How do we then best ensure that after we have saved the most amount of lives, that becomes clash two? So those are the things that you would evaluate the debate on. There will be times whereby it's not explicit what the teams are agreeing is true and important, right? That is when you follow two. If there is one thing all teams are implicitly agreeing is true and important based on the direction of the analysis that they are presenting in the debate, then that is what you are practically going to evaluate the debate on. So let's say no one is saying that the priority in this debate, in this room, should be to save the most amount of lives. No one is saying that. But their analysis is all alluding to the saving of the most amount of lives, or guaranteeing that people are going to have access to actualization, access to dignified lives after X event stated by the motion happens. Then that becomes the thing that you're going to evaluate on. Like, then you can explicitly say, we are evaluating the debate on this because all of the analysis is practically pointing towards this. And we're seeing, based on the analysis, X team ranks above this team because of ABC. We'll get into the ABCs on how to like evaluate a bit later, but that's practically what you would do in the second scenario where teams are being vague and they're not necessarily telling you as the judge what the priorities of the debate are and what you should be evaluating the debate on. Sorry. The third thing is, at a point in time, they're not agreeing on what we should be doing in the debate, what we should be focusing on, what we should be trying to solve. There's no agreement. Then you should be asking yourself, what is the one thing that has been successfully proven to be true and important, right? So there's like four competing metrics. No one is agreeing on which metric is the one that should be like the one that we should stick to in the debate. That's when you, as the judge, just go ahead and like look at who best proved their own metric to then evaluate who wins the debate and so on and so forth. That's not necessarily ideal. That shouldn't happen, but it could happen, and that's what you would do in that scenario. And then the last scenario, the worst scenario, whereby there is no agreement, there is no like metric to which they're giving you to judge the debate that they all are deeming to be true and important. It's just four cases have been presented to you. You then need to evaluate as the judge what would be important to the ordinary individual living on this planet, to the ordinary average intelligent voter. What would they deem as true? What would they deem as important? What would they deem as the priority in the debate? That is not ideal because remember, teams are supposed to be giving you, the judge, practically the metrics to which the debate is supposed to be judged on, what we should be focusing on in the round, and so on and so forth. But if this doesn't happen, then this is the algorithm that you would adopt for weighing. Try by all means to stick to the first point, right? To the first 2 points where you're looking for what all teams are explicitly or implicitly agreeing to be true and important in order to guide your clash evaluation and to guide how you are evaluating the minor contentions on the major contentions within the debate. To go in further, and this ties back to argument weighing, but this time just more in relation to each other. You could look at cases in relation to each other and determine which one is stronger than the other based on like these four things. So the first one is just the precision of the case that was presented, right? So is there a clear and specific claim that is being made, right? Because if there is a clear and specific claim that is being made and that is being proven, it's so much easier to see the direction that is going towards and to really see where it stands in relation to the motion and what it achieves in the debate in comparison to something that is vague and that is like vaguely proven. So look for precision within the argumentation. The other thing is the characterization behind the claim. Because characterization that is vague, characterization that is untrue, characterization that does not link to the analysis that is being given should like show you that the argument in and of itself is kind of shaky or is kind of weak in relation to the rest of the arguments that are being presented, or is just weaker in relation to the debate and the motion. I mean, if teams aren't really calling out that disconnect or whatnot, then you don't credit teams for that. It would just show up in their speaker scores that okay, they're not necessarily being the most sound in their argumentation or their analysis is weak to is vulnerable to like competent responses or to weak responses even because there isn't that clear link, that clear, precise and specific link between the characterization, the setup, the framing of their argument and the actual argument analysis afterwards. So look for precision when evaluating if one case is stronger than the other. The next is obviously the argumentation. So the detail with which relevant logic, with which they are analyzing the argument and they're presenting it. So you're looking at the logical claims, like how fledged out is the logic of the argument. You're looking at empirical evidence. So where are they practically, like, is there enough evidence from real world examples, from real world cases that back up whatever they are speaking about? And to further the empirical evidence, is there clear explanation as to why those specific cases that they are bringing or those specific examples that they are bringing happened the way that they did in order to lead to, I don't know, whatever consequence, whatever harm or benefit they are trying to like propose to the House? Was there enough justification behind like the causal processes or the mechanisms or the policies that they are trying to model within the debate? What is the detail of the moral intuition that they are trying to play on? Is it something that they are just asserting in the round, or is it something that they are actually doing the legwork to genuinely prove within the debate? What are the logical implications, or what are the other elements that are being explained to really detail the argument that is being presented to the House? So, yeah, that speaks to the layers of argumentation. Of course, you don't necessarily like buy into a case just because it has more layers. It might have more layers, but maybe those layers aren't necessarily done well. So that's why precision is also a very important thing. Like, has it been done in a specific manner that genuinely like makes sense and that genuinely links and ties back everything in relation to the motion and in relation to the debate? But then secondly, are there like multiple layers that patch up the argument and that patch up any doubt that could like seep into the argument and make it less persuasive? So that's like how you really question the extent to which you're crediting an argument over another argument. The other thing is responses, right? So by responses, we're not just looking at rebuttal that is given in the first 2 minutes of a speaker's speech. We're looking at any matter that is presented at any point that directly engages the matter that was presented by any other team in the debate. You really need to be looking at the cases and asking yourself, how does this respond to any of the material that has been given in the debate? So that one, you credit closing teams fairly for the engagement with the opening teams. Because sometimes opening teams might not necessarily take teams on their diagonal. Like, for example, OG might shut out CO, or CO more oftentimes might shut out OG. So you might end up like disingenuinely evaluating certain comparisons if you don't do the work of asking yourself, how does material presented as substantive material, actually engage with the material that might be presented later on in the debate. So evaluate responses to really see one, if it mitigates anything, if it mitigates the case that has been presented or that you are evaluating, if it takes it down completely, if it opens room for like questioning or so on and so forth. So really do the work to evaluate responses. There is quite a lot of responsive work that speakers do even in their substantive, because speakers are, I guess, becoming more and more versed in the art of preemptive, right? And also just the way debate works is that clashes just naturally form. So if a clash has formed, that means that arguments have had to have been presented that just clash with each other. So you should be asking yourself, how do those things not just clash, but how do they take each other down? Yeah. And then the last thing is metrics, right? Because um there might be a general clash, but there could be different reasons as to why teams are winning that clash. So some of like the general metrics, like there are so many more, but some of the general metrics that are there is like the mechanisms, right? So who just mechanistically proves that something is going to happen, right? There are principles, which principle weighs up over another and do we ought to protect for whatever reason presented in the house? What is the like there's the metric of impacts. You're evaluating the impacts based off of scale, how many people it affects. You could also be evaluating it on magnitude. So how deep are the impacts? Is it a minimal impact? Or is it like a massive impact? And then lastly, likelihood. How likely or guaranteed are we in achieving that impact through whatever mechanism that they are telling us, or through whatever model that they are presenting to the House for how we're going to achieve whatever impacts they're trying to present to us. The last thing, I mean, not the last thing, it's like another metric is the protection of the most vulnerable actor in the debate. And the last thing is like importance and priority. This metric speaks like to the whole logical priority thing that has been going on in the space. Like, in order to achieve this team's impact, this has to happen first, right? So in order to really evaluate clashes fairly and with the nuance that reflects the nuance that happened in the debate, um, ask yourself, on what ground are they genuinely winning this clash? Are they genuinely winning this exchange? Are they genuinely winning this debate? So that's a little bit on weighing. Then some tips for panel discussions, because at this point in time, you have evaluated the debate. The debate has happened. You have evaluated the debate. You have done your own personal weighing. And now it's time to engage in the panel discussion. Before that, there's one more thing that I actually needed to say in terms of weighing. So it's not on the notes, but it's practically just, at what point do you decide as a judge to weigh? Because there's two things that you could do. There's one, you could listen to the entire debate first and note down all of the arguments, and then after like all of the teams have spoken, do you then come up with your ranking, or do you then come up with like your evaluation of the clashes? Or you could go ahead and do it while the debate happens. So for example, Prime Minister speaks, Leader of Opposition speaks, you already know who is winning based off of that. DPM speaks, DLO speaks, you already know what is happening because you're weighing as the debate happens. I personally would recommend that you weigh up and that you track as the debate happens, because in real time, you then have your reason as to why you value one case over the other, as opposed to waiting for the end of the debate to then figure out, oh, I think in opening, I value this team over that team because of this reason and that reason. Because by that time, you could have actually lost the essence of the exchange or the clashes that actually happened, and thus you might not be crediting the teams fairly or evaluating the teams fairly. And then that, I don't know, that just messes up how the debate is being judged. So I would recommend that you just adopt all of, like, you ask yourself this and you look for this as the debate is happening. Now, some tips for panel discussions, right? Um, if you are a panelist, right? There are just a few things that you need to note just to be a more productive member of the panel discussion. Because as a panelist, you're there to practically help the chair um, come up to a fair and concise, I mean, like a fair and accurate call. It doesn't mean that you're less than the chair. No, like everyone on the judging panel is practically like a member of the panel. You all are important. It's just that the chair is the one that has to now go ahead and explain to the teams why the call came to why it did come to the call. So for the panel discussion to be as effective and as helpful as possible, you need to do a few things. You need to ensure you don't talk too much, right? And that you are as concise as possible. Because remember, you only have 15 minutes in total as a panel to discuss your call and to finalize your call. If you want to go ahead and take 2 minutes discussing one clash, when there are like so many other clashes and so many other exchanges to go ahead and discuss, then you are being an ineffective panel member. That will reflect on your score. That will hinder your ability to break, and that might even hinder your reputation in the debate space. So if you kind of care about that, ensure that you work on being concise as possible. The other thing is, and this one is a major one, answer the chair's question. So when a chair is asking you, could you please go ahead and explain why you valued this team over another team? The onus is on you to go ahead and just speak on those two teams. If you are suddenly bringing up another team in order to justify that specific diagonal or that specific pairing, then something is wrong, right? Like if they're just asking you about short diagonal, but you need to go ahead and use OG's case to explain how you evaluated short diagonal, then something went wrong in your judging because every team is supposed to be evaluated independently in comparison to the other team. So the gov bench comparison is independent to the op bench comparison. The diagonal comparisons are independent to the closing and opening comparisons. Yes, in the broader scheme of the debate, it might affect certain characterizations and like setup and like framing and what you buy into as true in the round. But you, as the judge, were supposed to have your own specific reason or a specific unique reason as to why OG ranked in relation to OO, why CG ranked in relation to OO, why CO ranked in relation to OO, without the other things influencing each other. So that is what the chair is likely to ask you about. And when they ask you about it, you need to stick to that precise comparison or clash that the chair is asking you to evaluate. But then lastly, you need to also not be too vague because we also need to, well, chairs also need to understand where exactly you are coming from. It's one thing to be concise and say, oh no, I valued team A over team B because of clash C. It's another thing when we just don't understand what you mean. That because that's a little bit too vague. So there are just a few examples on how you could navigate this better. In terms on how to be effectively concise while still giving us enough information to understand as your fellow panel members where you are coming from, the following could happen. So the chair asks you, who do you think won between A and B? You, as the panel members, say, okay, I think A won. I'll focus on the biggest like contention, which I think was efficiency, because that was the greatest, like those are the things that they were mainly talking about. But I can go into others if you want me to, but since this is the biggest thing, I'm just going to focus on this. Team A's point, Team A points out that B's case is premised on like means testing work, right? They give us four clear mechanisms on why means testing fails, right? And you can then list those mechanisms. You can say that you don't buy into all of those, because they're not proven equally well, but their mechanisms cause serious doubt on the effectiveness on means testing. And because of this, the argument that is presented by A when we're looking at efficiency, is, well, presented by B when we're looking at efficiency, isn't just mitigatory on its own, but when you pair it with, like the argument presented by A about the simpler policies existing in status quo, it puts A above B. You could say this concisely. This could take at max 45 seconds to go ahead and express if you have genuinely reasoned and evaluated the debate well. A minute, well, 45 seconds minimum, a minute at most, because you might talk differently. You might use your words differently, and that might cause you to use your time differently, but just try to like minimize on word economy, try to be concise like this. The other example, in terms of not being very vague, right, is this. You could go ahead and say, I'm struggling with how to credit the argument about like inflation measures. Team A said yada 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 yada. The government exhausts its like reserves and can't defend its currency. When the currency inevitably crashes, the poorest in import-dependent economies will be devastated. If I assume that defend its currency means this, then the argument makes sense. But I'm not sure that Team A like have actually given that like explanation. The argument about backlash had a pretty big gap, and that was pointed out by the teams. Is this a situation where the flaw is obvious enough to the point that Team A should be credited less, or given that this was not pointed out in the debate, like very like well, right? Is it too interventionist on our part? Things like this, going ahead and saying that I can see how argument A actually responds to a key premise in argument B, but this engagement is very implicit and the team frames this as rebuttal. It's almost as if they are inadvertently trying to disprove a premise of B, but to what extent should we consider this? I am not necessarily sure. If you give us those specific things, then it helps us to also see where to navigate ourselves in terms of the panel in evaluating the debate, right? So not only does this save time when you are navigating the panel discussion or when you are just contributing as a panel member, but it also makes the panel discussion a lot more efficient and effective. So just remember, whenever you are contributing in a panel, be concise and be specific. If they are asking about a particular clash or a particular comparison, whether that be like one of the diagonals, the opening, the closing comparisons, or the bench comparisons, you need to be specific to that. You need to be concise. Just tell us, what did you evaluate, what was said briefly, and then why you think that it ranks over the other thing. And then lastly, if you are going to like continue further, be specific. You don't buy into this because of A. You don't understand this because of B. This happened, and so it brings into question C, so that, yeah, the panel discussion is also like really, really effective. Um, the next thing is just like further discussions, right? So in terms of further discussions, it's also just some tips for the chair. As a chair, your role is to go ahead and guide the panel discussion, right? You have to be very strategic with how those 15 minutes are going to be spent discussing the motion. I mean, discussing the debate at hand. A few things that would be like that would be really, really helpful in terms of guiding or like in terms of setting the tone to which the panel discussion will happen is by first giving everyone like a minute or two to go ahead and like finalize their rankings, to finalize their last thoughts, right? So that you guys can start panel discussion with sure thoughts or with like comparatively sure thoughts, like a bit more surety than when you just go straight into it. Because there are times where you need to go ahead and look back at your notes and just really, really ask yourself, wait, do I gen do I genuinely want to credit this above this? Do I genuinely think that this was well proven? Do I genuinely think that this was the most important clash? And thus, because this team resolves this clash, that they should win, you know. So give teams those 2 extra minutes or so to go ahead and like to not teams, your panel members, those that 1 or 2 minutes to really just gather their thoughts. Then it's best to just collect everyone's calls, and it may also help to just go ahead and give out your call, just so that everyone can see where they stand. Um, if you suspect that some of the panelists might be a little bit more scared and they might be quite nervous to share their calls or might be nervous to deliberate after you give your call, um, then you could go ahead and just not share it just yet. You could just go ahead and compare like their like rankings and then ask them why they ranked or why their call came to be the way that it came to be. But I wouldn't necessarily like I wouldn't like it's not my first advice. It's not the first thing that I would genuinely do. I think that in most circumstances it really does help if you do go ahead and give your call just so that they can also see where the disagreement could be and could prepare themselves to better disagree with you and better give justification as opposed to when you don't give your call. It also just makes some people nervous. So let them give their call first. You give your call after. You evaluate where the agreement is. You evaluate where the disagreement is, and then you go straight into the discussing where those comparisons are. I think to further go ahead and make the panel discussion efficient, you should establish what everyone agrees what is said in the debate. So, for example, let's say everyone has CO fourth, everyone has um everyone has CO first. It's first like for second and third, it's a fight between OO and CG, but everyone has OG first. Establish what everyone heard from OO and CG, right? Then you ask, like the specific panel members that might be in the minority, what did they hear and and how did they, well, not what did they hear, because you guys all established what was heard, what the main fashions are. You ask them, why do they have X team winning over Y team? And hopefully, the panel member that is being asked this listened to the first tip and is just as concise as possible. So they actually give you that answer. I think to be further precise and concise, you could just go and ask them who do they think won or resolved this specific clash between these two teams, just so that you can quicker guide the discussion towards the main clashes or towards the key, like the key points of contention that happen in the debate, just so that the deliberation time, it's not wasted. It's not wasted on like misdirection and the discussion of less important points, but really the focus gets to more important points. And then, the like if this is done well, there might be time to actually discuss the other things, the other concerns that panelists might have, that could also be useful in the final evaluation and could be useful in communicating, like when you're giving the OA. So those are just a few tips for the panel discussion. Um, yeah. So the next thing is how to deliver a good OA. Because there are many different ways to deliver OA. You could go ahead and like just do it straight, like speaking, like going ahead from first to fourth. So explaining why this team gets first, this team gets second, this team gets third, this team gets fourth, or vice versa. You could go ahead and like speak about the comparison, like the comparison specifically. So you could first go ahead and speak about why the opening half comparison is like this, then go into closing half, then you go into short diagonal, then long diagonal, and maybe just hammer in on why the comparison is the way it is on GovBench and why it is the way it is on OpBench. The other thing, and this is the method that I use, is just going from OG to CO in chronological order so that they understand how you saw the debate as the debate happened, right? Whatever method that you decide to adopt, the biggest thing about OA, the biggest thing that you need to remember in OA is that each team should know why they ranked, where they ranked in relation to the other three teams in the debate. So, in your method, I must be like, if I am CG, I must be able to understand why I lost to OG but won against OO and CO in your OA. That must come up. And it is simple to come up with if you are just genuine with the comparisons. You genuinely weigh up those comparisons and you communicate that to the teams. I think that you should be adopting the method that is going to help you be as concise and efficient as possible. I personally found that just going ahead and saying, oh, this team catches a fourth because of this reason. This team did this to them. This team proves that their case doesn't stand. Their openings case is better like this, or their closings case is more expansive. That's why they get a fourth, and so on and so forth, up until you get to the winner of the debate. Just made it easier. The OA would be like less than 10 minutes, and then we could all move on and we all understood what was happening. But it wasn't necessarily the most concise. I've tried the method where you go and you speak about the opening half and you talk about the opening half clashes, opening half responses, and then the final decision and evaluation at the end of the day. And you do the same for every other comparison. That, for me, made the OA not only long, but it also makes it a little bit messy. So, if you know how to go ahead and just do that in a very strategic manner that helps you not just be concise, but also clear, then you can do that. The method that I'm using now, where I speak about what OG specifically says, how that relates to what OO is saying, what happens when CG comes into the debate, what happens when CO comes into the debate. I think that's helpful. I think that helps the OA to be really, really thorough and at times to also be more concise than the second method. So those are just some of the ways in which you could structure your OA. I think that in terms of the matter of the OA, always remember to go into key clashes. As I was saying, always remember to go into key clashes and then go and look at the responses that were also given to the debate. to the team in the debate, so that teams are actually aware that, okay, you did note this response. This is how far you credited the response in relation to the clash that you guys are discussing at that point in time. So, that's it in terms of the bulk of the OA. And I think the most major thing and the last thing that I'm going to discuss is practically how to track a debate, right? So I'm pretty sure that at this point in time, you've heard about a master sheet. Now, the master sheet is practically where you write all of the important points that come up in the debate, right? So personally, what I do is I have my general sheet, right, where I'm like writing um everything that the speakers are saying. And then I have the master sheet where I'm noting down the specific clashes that I'm noting between the teams. And on that sheet, I'm noting down why I'm buying into one team over another in real time. So have those two sheets. Well, have whatever you want, but as long as you like ensure that you have a master sheet where you are noting things down so that it's so much easier for you to track the clashes. It's so much easier for you to talk about the clashes during deliberation. And it's so much easier for you to give the oral adjudication based off of the clashes and based off of the responses that you noted down during the debate. Further tips in terms of good note tracking. I think the priority you should be having is ensuring that you are listening. Because when you're trying to transcribe, you're going to fail sometimes because you're not a machine that just has that ability to transcribe and transcribe accurately. Even Microsoft Teams does not do that well. The objective should be to go ahead and listen to the argument and get the crux of the argument first, then note it down so that you have it on record what is being said as the speech is progressing, as the debate is progressing. The other thing about like note taking is yeah, like okay, those are the two main things. Yeah, so you should aim to write as much as you are picking up. So that is to say, if you're listening to something and you're clocking what the speaker is saying, ensure that you're genuinely writing it down and you're noting it down so that you have it on record. But then secondly, even if you're not necessarily very clear, even after listening, because normally after just pausing, putting like stopping your pen, looking up and actually listening to what the speaker says, you should be understanding where they're taking their point and what they're trying to communicate to you. But if you're not, note that down. So if they're saying a point about like the protection of like the vulnerable actor, and let's say the vulnerable actor is children within the music industry, and you're not necessarily sure how what they're saying in terms of how they're achieving that protection, you could just note that down and say question mark so that you know that in deliberation you're going to then like ask you're going to then ask what are they practically saying about this point. That's how you get better at, well, that's how you can effectively track the debate and track your notes so that you are in tune with what is happening in the debate and you're not necessarily like lost during deliberation. And yeah, so those are the basics that I have for you. I am going to stop sharing because my presentation is over. Um, and I see there are questions. So, okay. Cool. We can now get into the questions. Um, okay, so the first one is what are some drills or tools you can use as a beginner judge? I think okay, there are many. I think the first thing that helped me when I was starting off with judging was practicing listening in real time. So that is to say, let's say I'm like speaking to someone, right? I'm asking them questions and I keep hammering the questions, asking and asking and asking, just so that one, I get better at active listening because as a judge, you're listening to eight different people over like at a in around an hour. You really need to work on your listening skills. So if you're doing that in real time, because you're always engaging with people, it is one practical way of getting better at your listening skills, but also just getting better at um picking out the direction to which things could happen. Because if you're asking, you're kind of like getting that other person to take whatever they're saying into a different direction, just so that you can also note down if they're really fulfilling what you're asking them. This also just helps with like looking at if people are fulfilling the burdens to which like the motion is placing on them, or so on and so forth. The other thing, which I guess is more typical for people to do, especially if you have time, is to go ahead and listen to debates and to just judge the debates in real time. So there are so many debates that are recorded, so many debates that are online. Um, Go ahead and search for one of those, and then in real time practice judging that debate. Another thing while doing that, so that you can get used to listening to how fast debaters are speaking, try and like set the setting to times 1.5 or times 2, just so that you're used to listening to people speak at that speed, or yeah, at that speed, just so that it's so much easier when you're actually judging debaters, because debaters really speak very fast. So go ahead and do that. But also, because global debating has so many different people, we're happy for that. And everyone has different accents. Try to look at debates from different regions so that you also accustom yourself to listening to so many different people, so many different voices, so many different accents for you to get better at judging. While doing this, a few things that you could be doing is really just practicing on your clash analysis, right? So after every debate, ask yourself, why do I rank opening the way that I'm doing? Why am I ranking closing the way that I'm doing? Why am I ranking the diagonals and the benches the way that I'm doing? You're asking yourself all of the questions that you saw. So asking yourself, is this true? Is this important? Is this proven? You're asking yourself, at what point am I crediting this over the other? You're asking yourself, in what metric, like at what metric is this team winning the debate on? And by doing that, that's also just another way you can just practically get better at debate judging. I hope that answers your question. Jayoti. Sorry if I'm not pronouncing the name well, but yeah. Um, you can just react with a thumbs up if it makes sense, or you can just like comment and stuff. The next question is, when you're aiming to reach a majors, what are some aspects you should consider as a roadmap? Um, it's so okay, if you're aiming to reach a majors, you really need to go ahead and consider. Okay, by consider as a roadmap, I'm not necessarily too sure what you mean. I think that if there's anything that you should take into consideration, you should consider how much judging you have actually done, or how much engagement with debating you have done in order to actually not just reach a major, but be familiar with what is going to happen in the major. The best way to practice debate judging is by doing tournaments. So I know that there's a lot of tournaments that are looking for judges because judges are in such short supply. So you can get like a subsidized judge slot, or you can get like an IA position, but always ensure that you are practicing debate judging as often as possible, especially if it is a major. I think another thing you should be considering is yeah, I think just practice, like a lot of practicing in order to just get better by the time that you reach a major. If you do like the drill of listening to debates, right, as often as you can, or listening to people and their opinions as often as you can, you get better at active listening, but then you get better at just listening to the debates and really picking, like really just judging and evaluating the debate and weighing it up the way that judges are supposed to. So, that's, I guess, like the best thing that I can say in terms of what you should consider if you're trying to reach a major. I think if it's a union question on how can you convince your union to take you to a major, again, just have an extensive judge CV and just get better. Well, not just get better, but like grow in your judging capacity so that they can send you to the major. Yeah. The next question is, um, in case of close judging calls and somewhat derivative content from extensions, how do you deal with that? So in terms of somewhat derivative content, you look at the extent to which it changes anything in the debate. Because if it yields the same things as the opening team, then you really cannot credit it much in relation to the opening team. And so you can't necessarily have that above the other. That shouldn't be a close call. It should be quite clear that you should like in terms of the panel discussion, you should all discuss to what extent this is derivative. And it must be clear that it is derivative because of A, because of B, because of C. Like the framing might be derivative, but maybe the mechanism to which that they're going with is different and it yields to the same impact. If the mechanism itself seems to be a more plausible mechanism than whatever opening is like presenting, then that middle of it does kind of change the debate because it proves likelihood. There you can kind of like flip a call or something. You can credit that extension as a valid extension. But if it really doesn't do much, then you don't credit that extension. In terms of yeah. So have that discussion as a panel, really like show each other to what extent it is derivative, what extent is not, and then ask yourself, sorry about that other phone call, but yeah, as I was saying, have that discussion to what extent something is derivative, have the discussion to what extent you're going to be crediting that thing, um, in and of itself in relation to the debate, and then have that discussion on where you're going to like how you value that in comparison to the other teams in the debate. Then in terms of like close judging calls, if after because if it's a close call, then the discussion should be about the main contentions that happened between the teams that are like in discussion, right? And then if just so that you guys can understand or like can come to some sort of agreement to what extent, I mean, well, not to what extent, like you come into agreement on who won over who for whatever reason they're winning. If at the end of the day it's still a thing of you guys aren't don't all have a and cut clear cut call in terms of that close judging call, then you just call it to a vote. You communicate that there was a split. If it's a thing of the chair was in the minority and they thought that the other team should have won, then at that point in time, the panelist that was in the majority, someone on the panel that was in the majority, should then come up and communicate the call to the rest of everyone, just so that they understand why there was that contention, why it came close, but why there was a split at the end of the day, and why majority of the panel ended up rolling the chair. Um, so that's practically how you would deal with like close judging calls. Um, the next question is, what are some differences we have when judging in different regions. I face some issues adjusting when I am doing competitions beyond my region. This is a good question. Um, so, okay. So in terms of, I guess the Asian circuit, I've noticed that um yeah, you like it's very impact heavy. There needs to be very clear mechanisms. There's a lot of like clarity that needs to be brought in terms of guarantee, like proving that something is guaranteed and something is likely to happen. And so there's that like emphasis on mechanism and impact. At least that's what I've experienced in like the Asian circuit. In the Southern African circuit, there's a lot of emphasis in terms of the principle of things. So you're going to hear a lot of teams trying to like show that things aren't just going to happen, but they need to be justified in the way that they happen. We need to protect certain principles and certain morals because that's the fabric of society or whatnot. In the West African circuit, that might be different because in the West African circuit, they're very to the manual. So they're very technical. They stick to the manual, and the way in which they mechanize and they layer is also very different. I think in like those status A circuits, so like the American circuit and the European circuit, um, I can't necessarily say much. I think it's also just like similar to like the West African and the Asian circuit where there needs to be a lot of there needs to be a lot of layering of argumentation and so on and so forth. So because of those differences, the speaking philosophies is going to be different. The judging philosophies is going to be different. I think that because differences exist, you should always remember to just stick to what the average intelligent voter should be doing in terms of judging. So you should be very clear in terms of why you are evaluating something in the way that you are evaluating it. And it's still going to be valued, even if you are from a different region. Well, depending on different extents, as long as like socio-political factors don't come into play on the panel discussion. But it's still going to be valued. So just stick, like if you're trying to adjust and you're trying to really like find footing within other regions during other tournaments, then yeah, the best advice is to just stick to the basics. Always ensure that you have a call, always ensure that you're sticking towards the comparisons. Always ensure that you have a clear metric as to why you are valuing one team over another when it comes to this specific clash. If you're going to be leaning on like role fulfillment, like this team didn't necessarily like value like fulfill their role or so on and so forth, then just note it might not like if that's how you normally do things, then just note that that might not be something that really like sticks in certain circuits. So you kind of just have to practice existing in different circuits and in different debate regions so that you kind of know what the judging philosophies are, what people value in terms of the debate and so on and so forth, just so that you can adjust better and you can adjust in the long run. But yeah, I guess like in terms of the basics of how to adjust when you're just going into it is just sticking to the basics. And then the last question we have thus far is I have seen that wait, LD, PF, Asians, and BP, amongst other formats, have different judging expectations. Maybe can you please tell us about this? Um, Wait, could you just wait? I'm assuming PF is public forum, then Asian parliamentary, British parliamentary. I'm not necessarily sure. Whoa, Lincoln Douglas. Oh, LD is Lincoln Douglas. Okay. So, I'm not necessarily familiar of like with many of these like formats because I mainly just do British parliamentary and world schools debating, right? Um, I think, yeah, just there are so many different debate groups that exist. you could go on like debate serious posting and then just, I guess, asking someone to differentiate between the judging expectations there. If judging expectations should even be there in the first place to just get better clarity on that. I think that in terms of the difference with formats, I'll just base it off of the difference I see between BP and world schools. First of all, there's the difference in expectations is in terms of the like just in terms of how much you're actually evaluating. Of course, in BP, I think there's the greatest expectation for you to really know and be able to evaluate that many clashes, evaluate that many teams, and that can be a little bit harder, but it is something that you eventually adjust to. I think that if you're able to really judge in BP and evaluate things in BP, it makes other formats that might just be like two teams, as opposed to four teams, a lot easier, and so on and so forth. So, yeah, I can't really tell you about the different judging expectations there. I'm really, really sorry. But I think that if you just try and like search for it, the information is out there. So, yeah, so sorry, Jesse, but yeah, cool. Yeah. Uh, are there any other questions? Any other concerns anyone has?
Yeah, I don't think they have any other questions or more information to share. So I think we can also start to wrap up. Thank you so much again, Pinel, for a wonderful session. We are glad to have you had time to come and talk to us and discuss basics of judging as well as give us very important pointers, which would obviously help a lot of people when they're listening into this. So again, thank you so much, and we hope to see you again soon.
Cool. Thank you guys for having me. If you guys do have any questions, then you can reach out. I don't know if it makes sense to just like leave like I don't know like my Facebook details so that you guys can reach out to me in Messenger. Uh
I'll do that.
I
I'll put your FB details when I'm uploading the video to YouTube.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay, cool, cool, cool. So no problem. Everyone, good luck. Trust me, judging is fun. Judging is really fun. I think that it's more fun than speaking. It might be a bit more stressful than speaking, but it's fun. And you guys will do great in your judging careers as long as you just continue to engage with judging. Um, as long as you read the manual and actually apply it, you'll be fine. So yeah, good luck, everyone. Thank you for having me, and good day or good night, depending on your time zone. Bye.
Yep. Thank you again. Bye bye.